Great. You know, as communicators, I think we tend to throw the word disruptive around a little too much. But describing the public policy arena right now as disrupted doesn't really do it justice. When you have armed insurrectionists storming the doors of Congress, carrying a hit list, including members of both parties, I think you've gone beyond disruption into something quite different. But last year was certainly unique in my experience of American politics. I moved to the States in 1987, and while I'm no longer living there, I certainly check the Washington Post every morning before I check the Guardian. My political interest lies on that side of the Atlantic. So I was delighted to get the chance to moderate this discussion and bring together a couple of political heavyweights who can cast much more light on what's going on than I can with my distance observations. We have with us Daniel Schwarz, who is currently Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at Hill & Knowlton Strategies, but was formerly Director of Strategic Communications at the House Judiciary Committee. And we have Jake Sherman, a former head of Politico's Playbook and the founder of PunchBowl News, and the co-author of the intriguingly titled The Hill to Die On, The Battle for Congress and the Future of Trump's America, which sort of raises the question. I know this is not the main point of the discussion, but I'm interested. Are we actually still living in Trump's America despite the events of the last 3 months and his eventual untidy exit from 1600? You're muted.
Apologies for that. That would be a challenge. The answer, unless you could all lip read it, the answer to that is yes. The answer is, of course. We are very much in Trump's universe, in his political universe. He's the most powerful Republican across the country in Republican districts. He has 80, between 60 and 80% approval rating. He's an incredibly popular politician with the base. And if you're out of step with him, you're out of step with the base, and you're out of step with Republican voters.
So is Trumpism the force that is driving the disruption that is the topic of this discussion, or is it a broader, more multifaceted sort of public engagement with the political realm and the policy realm and the issues environment?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question. I mean, Jake is certainly right in terms of the influence that Trump has had on the larger landscape. Part of the question going forward is how much Trump as an individual continues to influence it, but certainly the landscape has changed by virtue of Trump and by other factors. Part of that has been the reaction to Trump over the past 4 years, which has generated and created more opportunities for there to be both a larger audience and more disparate audiences all over that can participate in different types of debate. And so that is in part a reaction to different communities, different groupings having reactions to national policy issues, but also the fact that there's a realization that there are so many other levels at which there are decisions being made of public policy or political significance that creates an entirely new, more dynamic landscape for public affairs in general.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like for 4 years, everything was either a cheering on of the Trump administration or a violent, equal and opposite reaction against what was going on in the Trump administration. And I guess I'd hoped that we might get back to normal, but is that normal now? Is that what we're faced with going forward? Not necessarily the individual, but that kind of dynamic disruption?
Well, I would argue, and this is just perhaps my personal view, I'm not very interested in talking about Trump much anymore. The government is his. I mean, to the extent he needs to be spoken about, I think I'm fine reporting on him. He's not the center of my universe. Certainly, he's a former president who's going to try to play a role in the Republican Party going forward, and I think he'll have some success, some failure. We'll have to see, and we'll judge him based on that. But in the meantime, Congress and this president, the president that beat Donald Trump, is trying to push through a $3 trillion, a $2 trillion spending bill, and is trying to rework American infrastructure, and has a whole host of priorities. So listen, I think the tribalized nature of politics is nothing new from the Trump era. I think it's new from 2010 and 2011 when there was an equal but opposite reaction to Barack Obama on the right, and that kind of culminated and crescendoed with Trump. So I would argue that is that's the main fallout, and that's how the dynamic was structured.
Yeah, just to kind of echo Jake's point, and he can speak to this, having reported on it for the last 4 years. But the relevance that continues is the example that was set for the ease with which the public debate can be influenced and turned in different directions. All it took, and I spent a lot of my time over the past 4 years as well, where the ease with which a single tweet could change the events over the next 24 hours did not exist before. And that was something that was utilized to great effect by Donald Trump in order to win the nomination and then run the presidency. But that is also being used in smaller public spheres all over the place, as the ease with the audience in general that can participate is bigger. The ease with which those different audiences can participate and have an impact on public debates or even internal debates is easier. And really, more generally, there's a kind of democratization of these power conversations, as you can have an individual that is outside of the traditional group of players, traditional government, traditional politicians, traditional media, that are able to sway the conversation in a bigger way. There really are no more closed rooms. Donald Trump was an outsider and came in as part of opening up that room to a larger public. And I think we've seen over the last 4 years, and we'll continue to see, how that is being utilized in a variety of fronts, not just at the federal level, but beyond that.
And the sort of preamble for this discussion in our marketing materials says the public discusses the public's increasing influence as active participants rather than mere observers. I don't think it's any secret to anybody watching this that my political views are broadly on the progressive side of the spectrum. And those of us on that side of the spectrum have been, for the most part, saying for years that we want that. We want people to be more engaged in the political process. We want people to be more active, to be participants rather than observers, to feel that they can make a difference. And then when people started to feel that way and didn't necessarily drive the discussion in the way that we wanted it driven, we were horrified, I suspect, many of us. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it how will it play out in the future going forward? Do you think it will end up being a net positive?
Well, I think in a democracy, participation is a plus. I think that's there's no question about that. I think that the flattened kind of nature of public discourse is a positive. And as somebody who's an active participant in, I do think this, and this is kind of the foundation for what we're doing at PunchBowl News. But I think that I think news and politics, frankly, for too long have been a one-way street, right? I think that news outlets have shoved information down your throat for too long, and not have created the feedback loop that kind of exists with any other consumer product, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into. And I think, frankly, in the political space, technology has done that, obviously, and created some sort of, creating the flattened structure that helps, I would say, hold people accountable, hold officials accountable to public opinion, and so forth. So I think it's an inescapable facet of our society right now.
Yeah, but in a small d democratic sense, it is a positive. There are no closed rooms, and that means that in impacting or influencing the debate, it's not just about having ins in the room where decisions happen, or that those ins can come from a variety of different sources. At the same time, because of that more dynamic nature, it means that there needs to be a more sophisticated approach. It's not just having the contact book in order to be able to influence those ins in the room. It is much more integrated and incorporative of different audiences, different medias, and spaces where these conversations are taking place, and bringing all of that to bear in approaching these conversations needs to be the case, because you could have a negative, depending on your point of view on the particular issue, you could have a negative outcome in that democratization that is going on if you decide to ignore it or are not being mindful of these wider spaces, because they are equally as impactful, if not more impactful, than they were ever before.
And it's also interesting to me that for years, the public affairs profession would talk about grassroots and the importance of mobilizing ordinary people to get involved with individual issues. But there was always, I think, an understanding that, or a feeling that, whether you were working for corporate public affairs or issues activists and advocates, you could drive the conversation and sort of set the tone of the terms of the debate. What we seem to be seeing now is something that is much less top down and much more bottom up, and therefore much less controllable. But from a public affairs perspective, how do you tap into that and not necessarily co-opt it, which is probably difficult and counterproductive, but how do you make that work for you? Can you make it work for you?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think it's important to realize in understanding the landscape and what it means for it to be a more dynamic space, the public sphere, is that politics and policy decisions don't operate in a vacuum. And so there needs to be the ability to adapt in order to influence at multiple levels. And so you can have federal, regional, local public conversations and debate, or even at times international debates that happen in separate areas, but are still related and have a same or can have a similar impact, even if they're happening in different media channels or in different levels, federal, state, local. Whether you're talking about COVID response or economic recovery or regulation, a conversation at the state level in California on certain tech regulations can influence or be influenced by a conversation internationally in the European Union, which can also have an influence in the way that federal regulators start considering these issues in Washington, D.C. All of that comes into play in a space that is open to the bigger world of conversations, but also those conversations don't necessarily interact directly one-on-one. And so having that wider perspective on things is important. It all doesn't just happen in one spot.
What about the media perspective on this, Jake? How has it changed how you do your job, how you select which issues are going to get covered and whose perspectives are going to get heard?
So in my world, and my world is pretty strictly limited to the Capitol, I don't have as much of a I don't really have as much of a existential debate going on about that, because my job is to report on what the leadership and analyze what the leadership is doing, saying, thinking, trying to do, and on any given issue. I will say this though, I think that we've come to a post I think we've come to a post. I don't want to. I should be careful what I say. We've come to almost a post-objective stage in journalism, in the sense that, listen, I think that when it's not productive for the media to be spreading disinformation just because it's what someone says, right? I mean, if someone, yesterday, this is just a small example of this, but yesterday, some senators suggested that maybe it wasn't an armed insurrection in the Capitol. Well, I was here. It was an armed insurrection in the Capitol. So there is no kind of two sides to that story, right? So
but you also debunk the idea that it was driven by Antifa rather than...
Right, unless we have some intervening information from an authority, meaning the FBI, the police, Department of Justice, that indicates that it was Antifa, we could take the simplest answer, which is that it was Trump supporters, which everybody agrees that it was, and not listen to crackpot conspiracy theories. But anyway, that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, and look, if a post-objectivity environment means that you're actually going to call crackpot, not you personally, but the media in general, are actually going to call crackpot conspiracy theories, I think, we all should be welcoming that. Objectivity and both sidesism are two completely different things, and it'll be nice to move beyond the latter. But you say you're covering the leadership and that sort of top of the pyramid there, but what's influencing the leadership is very different now than what was influencing them 10 years ago, right? And you have to, that has to inform how you approach those issues.
Yeah, well, I don't know about 10 years ago. Sorry, I'm in the Capitol right now, so there's a lot of phones ringing and bells whistling at all times, so I apologize for that. No, I don't know that it was different. I think here's the way I view coverage in broadly speaking. Our job is to know what leaders are doing before they do it and understand why they are doing it, what constituencies they're trying to please. I think too much of the media, and Paul, maybe maybe you'll disagree with this, but I believe too much of the media is is giving people a place to go to agree with their own opinions or whatever. My estimation is that at PunchBowl News, our goal is not to be a place where you go to read about Mitch McConnell if you hate him or love him, or read about Nancy Pelosi if you hate her or love her, but to understand what they're doing before they do it, and to understand what drives them. And what drives them may be complex political considerations, they may be stupid political considerations, they might be narrow, they might be deep, they might be wide, but it's our job to present them and to analyze them. And I don't know that it was different than it was 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago, we're in 2021. I think 10 years ago was kind of the beginning of this phase, to be honest with you. Maybe if you go 20, 30 years ago, maybe if we go back to the 80s or the 70s, 40 years ago, there was a different set of considerations. Now the goal is to get power, keep power, and increase power. That's the kind of in my estimation, the spectrum that drives most elected officials, especially in the leadership.
Fair enough.
But I do think, just to jump in real quick, if as part of the question for Jake is, Jake can attest as part of launching PunchBowl News and seeing the impact that PunchBowl News has, is that as much as Jake will define himself or can define himself as a Capitol Hill reporter, the audience for PunchBowl News is not just those grass top decision makers in Washington. The readership that reads his emails every single morning and looks at what's going on is all over, and Jake can speak to that, and that is because of the influence of Washington everywhere, and it being outside of the bubble of Washington, and at the same time the fact that, and Jake knows this from his previous stint at Politico, the fact that you have bubbles all over that impact back in Washington D.C., and because of that it creates much more of a back and forth interaction that is beyond the traditional models and kind of gatekeepers of validation or authenticity or right and wrong, and that's kind of the new age that we're in.
I would say two things on that front, and this is particularly important for, I think, your audience to understand, and frankly, everyone to understand. I think the way we describe our audience is people who live and work in Washington, and people who need to understand Washington because they work somewhere else, whether that's Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Austin, any place that has industries that rely heavily on some sort of government activity, whether it's oil or technology or whatever. And what Danny said is right. It's more about, first of all, the media is getting flatter, right? I was at a large news organization for 11 years. I was, and I went out on my own with two other reporters and have started an outlet that's read just as much as many large news organizations, and hopefully will make as much money to scale as many large news organizations. So I don't think that I actually think we're in a new era of the individual content creator. We see that with people like Joe Rogan in the podcast space, and and that's important for I think your industry to understand as well, is that there's for you guys, and this is not, I'm so ill-equipped to talk about this, but I'll just say that, like, and when I talk to sources and I'm trying to get them to tell me something or to give me something that they would otherwise give to the New York Times, the Washington Post, what I say is, you can go to the New York Times, the Washington Post, but I could tell you that I have a much more captive and a captive audience and intimate relationship with that audience than some big newspaper that's going to put you on 8:15 and not give you time of day. So I think there's just an interesting relationship there.
Yeah, no, I think that's the important lesson for public affairs, and that is, moving away from public affairs as more of a transactional approach or orientation, and being more about building a strategy and a communications framework for having an impact in pursuing, whatever the objective of the client is. Understanding PunchBowl News's impact and the way that has ripple effects in the different audiences and decision-making spaces that you needed to have, versus the Washington Post, New York Times, MSNBC, CNN. And so in making that adjustment to being more oriented towards harnessing mutual interests and utilizing those public debates is really where this new open field for public affairs rests, because of the changing nature of the media environment and going to a flatter model rather than, these titans of traditional powerhouses in power conversations.
And you used a word a couple of minutes ago, Dan, that I was going to bring up when you talked about gatekeepers. And, we all used to know who the gatekeepers were, right? I mean, there were directories of them, not that you needed one, because you sort of, if you were in that world, you knew. But who are the new gatekeepers? Who are the people out there who are in non-traditional roles outside of big media and outside of big organizations who are important in the public affairs process now?
Yeah, I don't know that I would use the terminology new gatekeepers. I think that the media is as much a participant as an authenticator or validator of the public debate that is going on. And so the ability to control the conversation from those traditional institutions is less, but I don't think that they've been replaced. It's just created a much larger community of people that can have an impact on the conversation. And so then the job is the ability to see the larger landscape, see the bigger field at play. What are the different constituencies and groups and areas that these conversations are happening that are important to be part of a stakeholder mapping exercise or part of an outreach and engagement plan, because of the different ways that they have an impact in the decision making that happens at the end of the line. And that can be decision making for the New York City Council when it comes to Amazon HQ2, or it can be at the federal level when it comes to COVID relief funding.
And are the platforms that you need to use to move opinion changing?
I think they're changing it in the fact that it is not just the access to the New York Times and the Washington Post editorial boards that move the conversation, right? Social media is a great democratization of a political voice, and the very nature of social media is reacting to something that happens or putting out an opinion generates more opinions and more reactions. And that creates smaller bubbles of conversation and influence. But it doesn't just have to be on big public policy debates. You can have conversations amongst employees or conversations amongst certain communities that are dealing with local issues. And there are new channels. Facebook isn't new and Twitter isn't new, but areas that did not have as big an influence on the decision making that they did before are now having that greater influence. And so there needs to be the appreciation and a skill set that has both a strategic orientation towards the power of these different groups, but then really brings an integrated approach to communication, because public affairs is not just knowing the person in the room. There is an element of crisis communications in there. There is issue management. There is C-suite level advisory services that have to come into play because of the this more dynamic landscape where there are so many different levels of influence and conversations and public audiences that do have an impact and are important to decisions that affect, a bottom line.
And we're coming to 2 or 3 minutes left in our time, but Jake, I'd like to wrap up by asking you where this is going. We've been using the phrase new normal in other contexts for the last year. Will this settle into a new normal that will be somewhat predictable? Or is the dynamism and disruption that we're talking about something that is going to constantly roil and transform the environment in which you guys operate going forward?
Probably the latter to some degree. I mean, I think that it's hard to turn back the clock, but I do think, listen, in the political space, I think that I think that things have calmed down a bit since the White House has changed. But frankly, I mean, to what you guys were saying before, I mean, what Danny was saying, I mean, there's people are living in different spaces right now. I mean, the conversation is dynamic. The conversation is not taking, I mean, as much as you want to move public opinion always, and this is exactly what Danny said, and he's so right about this. Like, a lot of people can move conversations in a lot of different ways. And it's not only the New York Times editorial board, and it's not only the Washington Post. And I would say that things are, a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to get conversations back to logical places. That's a very tough business to be in. I mean, the public affairs journalism space is just a lot different, and there's a lot of so to answer your question, the latter. I mean, things are crazy. They're going to remain crazy, and you have to adapt to that craziness to be successful, in my estimation.
Great. Okay, that was really rapid fire conversation. And I suspect we could have taken twice as long and considered the issues more deeply. But we have to move on.